Hello and welcome, everyone. It's a delight to welcome you to Intersection. I'm here today, Carson Reed, along with my co-host, Randy Harris, and we're just delighted to welcome Tom Long with us today. Tom, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great. Well, our topic today is preaching the epistles toward faith formation. We're going to be talking preaching. We're going to talk about epistolary sections of the New Testament, and we're going to be attending to questions around faith formation in our congregations and communities today. It's going to be a great conversation. We're delighted to have all of you joining. Please say hello in the chat feature. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Give us a shout there. Welcome that. We're going to be engaging with Tom over the next half hour or so, but we'll also want to listen to your questions. So if a question comes to you, you've got a question for Tom, then please let us have that through the Q&A section. Down at the bottom, you'll find the Q&A button. Use that to ask your questions. Well, Dr. Tom Long comes to us after a long career of teaching preaching. I first got to know you, Tom, at Emory at Candler years ago. Probably you're best known for many of the folks who are joining us for your significant, I'm going to call it a watershed book, The Witness of Preaching. And for those of you who would like to get to know some of Tom's work better, you might find the second edition of Tom's book on bookshelves or at Amazon today. Tom, you came on my radar screen with an earlier book that you published, or an early book on I think it was Preaching in the Literary Forms of the Bible, and which really was a significant transition for me as a preacher back late 80s, early around 89 or 90, somewhere in that time. But we're just delighted to have you with us today to be our conversation partner as we think about preaching. Before we get into this conversation today, I'm going to invite us to a minute of silent prayer. Let's acknowledge the presence of God even in this digital space today. O God, Creator, Redeemer, ever-present Spirit, we ask that you would bless our conversation today, that your word might inform our words through the work of preaching for the sake of your purposes in the church and for the world. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Tom, as we get this thing started, we're using several things here as kind of anchor points. We're talking about preaching. The second thing we're doing is thinking about the epistles. And the third thing is this idea of faith formation. And that I kind of want to tease out a little bit of that as we begin to think about faith formation. What is it about our cultural time? What is it about our moment in time that makes faith formation something critical for churches and faith communities to pay attention today? What are you seeing going on that prompts that kind of question?
Yeah, well, thanks, Carson. Let me take one step back, take a running start at that. I think in terms of preaching, there's some things about preaching that never change. We are to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to a world in need. That is always true. But like music, the styles and techniques and forms and themes of preaching change in response to cultural moments and cultural needs. And I think we're right at a break point in terms of what preaching needs to become to address this particular cultural moment. And I should confess, this is a hard one for me, because I have always been a narrative preacher, and I think we are at the end of a certain kind of narrative moment in preaching. Narrative was always a response to boredom in the culture. The first time we had narrative preaching in America was after the First Great Awakening, and Puritan preaching was so dull that Methodists and African Americans began to introduce stories. Then after the Civil War, sort of default Calvinism was so dull. And preachers in the Industrial Revolution began to experiment with narratives. And then in the 70s, the culture was roaring, the 60s and 70s, and American Christianity seemed dull, and narrative was a response to that. Mm-hmm. Well, there is still some boredom in the church and in the culture, of course, but I don't think the primary crisis now is boredom. I think the primary crisis is in an increasingly secular time.
Yes. When
the church is grayer and poorer and smaller, and as Andrew Root says, it's many congregations are depressed. They don't know what their mission is. Mm-hmm. There's an uncertainty about the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And so people aren't bored nearly as much as they're unformed or even malformed. I think we're seeing some serious distortions of the Christian faith in our culture. And one of the reasons that I think epistles are not the only resource, but one tool for a preacher, is because they are the earliest expressions of the Christian faith done to a multicultural, multi-faith, fragile Christian communities not yet formed in the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And so a kind of renewed look at the New Testament letters, I think, can give us a way of speaking to this particular moment in our cultural time.
I love that, Tom. You've given us a quick snapshot of just the way in which preaching shifts and changes from generation to generation. You're noting that we're at a point where there is a shift that's occurring that calls for a different kind of preaching. You're talking now, you've kind of introduced the idea of how there's this need for, perhaps there's a need for formation in our life of our communities. And so the epistles become a live place for that. What is it? Talk a little more about the epistles. Sometimes I think we just think, oh, there's Romans, this major treatise in theology or something. But what is it about the epistles that make it particularly poignant for our time and space?
Well, you hit right on it when you mentioned Romans, because I think for a lot of us, especially in the Protestant tradition, we tend to think of the epistles as a collection of doctrinal statements. It's where Luther discovered justification by faith, and that's sort of the primary resource of an epistle. But actually, the epistles are more about rich on-the-ground practices of the Christian faith. Years ago, Don Browning in Pastoral Care was very prescient about this. He wrote a little book in which he said, a lot of us as pastors were trained that when somebody needs pastoral counseling, we're supposed to say, hey, there's no right or wrong here. There's just grace. And so I want to have a relationship of grace with you, and you can rebuild your life and go about taking care of things. But Browning said, now people are not coming to us and saying, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't do it. What they're coming to us and saying is, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what the shape of a Christian life is. And so into that gap have come things like Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life, which is really a kind of book of etiquette about how to behave as a Christian to people who know how to behave in the financial markets and know how to behave at the country club, but as Christians, they don't know how to be. And I think the epistles are not just rules about how to behave. They are, what does it look like when the grace of Jesus Christ takes form in human life? And the task of preaching epistles then becomes, what is the form of Christian living that is being lifted up here? And in our time, what does that look like? If I could give one example.
Yeah.
On Easter, I used to love to preach on 1 Corinthians 15 because it struck me at the time as a kind of proof of the resurrection. What Paul would say is the problem in Corinth was a lot of them didn't believe in the resurrection. They saw no need for the resurrection. They were having wonderful spiritual experiences in church, speaking in tongues and spiritual gifts manifested all over the place. Who cares about the resurrection? And Paul gives this argument that says, if there is no resurrection, then Christ was not raised. If Christ was not raised, then our preaching was a lie. And if our preaching was a lie, your faith is in vain, empty buckets. Mm-hmm. And I always thought there's a syllogism there, if I could figure it out, that would prove the resurrection, but of course it doesn't. And what I realized was that it's actually an argument that works backwards. Mm-hmm. It moves toward, if none of this is true, then your faith is in vain, to which the Corinthians would say, wait a minute, our faith is not in vain. That's the one thing we're sure of. We rock and roll on Sunday morning. Well, if you rock and roll on Sunday morning, then the preaching that generated that was true. And that preaching was about the resurrection, and therefore the resurrection is true. So my Easter preaching now is not trying to prove the doctrine of the resurrection. Mm-hmm. It's pointing to places in the actual life of the congregation to which I'm preaching, where the resurrection is vibrating with power in their faith and life. Mm-hmm. And that the reason for that is the risen Christ is at work among you. There's why the resurrection is key. So it's a kind of a figure ground reversal on how to treat these texts, not as rules to be behaved or doctrines to be believed, but as practices to be lived out.
Yeah. So, Tom, let me describe to you Church of Christ preaching over the last 50 years and get you to react to it. I don't know that we're terribly different than some other groups, but it does has its own kind of distinction. So there was a lot of epistles preaching back then. And it was because we were a group driven by doctrine, and it was pretty easy to do doctrinal stuff out of the epistles. And it generally wasn't preaching through a book of the Bible. It was dropping into a text and grabbing hold of the doctrinal nugget there. And then somebody noticed that all of that wandered quite a ways away from the story of Jesus Christ. And so then there was a whole generation where, okay, we're going to preach the Gospels, the gospel from the Gospels. It's the Gospels, because that's where you get centered on Jesus Christ. And there was much less epistle preaching and more of that kind of narrative preaching through a gospel thing. And if I'm following you, you sort of like, well, okay, the world is kept spinning, and I assume that you think there's a way of doing this out of the epistles that just preaching gospels doesn't get at. Is that that's the deal?
Yeah, that's the deal. But I'm not abandoning the preaching of the gospels. I'm adding to our toolbox here. But I think your description of Church of Christ preaching over the last 50 years is not just Church of Christ. It's for a lot of us that the letters of the New Testament were either about doctrine or they were about ethics. And if we preached doctrine, then we tended to bore people, and that's what led to narrative preaching. And no wonder we went to the Gospels, not simply to recover Jesus Christ, but to get story in there that had some magnetism to it. And we avoided preaching the ethics part because it seemed to us works righteousness. Just telling people what to do was not what we were supposed to be about in the pulpit. And I think both the extreme doctrinal understanding of epistles and the extreme ethics understanding of epistles are misunderstandings of the epistles. I think what they're about is, what does the story of Jesus Christ look like when real people try to live it out in their real concrete lives? And so it becomes about children and sex and money and relationships, not because they are rules, but because this is the way people have to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ in their real lives. For example, I never preached on that word in the book of James about your tongue is very dangerous. It's like the rudder of a ship. You get it out of whack and it'll get off course. It's like a match that sets a forest on fire. How dare you talk about God and praise with your mouth and then criticize people created in the image of God? Straighten out your language. I thought that was way too small to preach on. That's just a little rule. I have a daughter named Melanie, and when she's a professional educator now, and we have a terrific relationship. But when she was a teenager, she and I would often get in father-teenage daughter collisions. And one time in the middle of one of those arguments, I looked at her and said, "Melanie, you're nothing but trouble to me." That's not the kind of thing I would say. I don't even remember saying it, but she does. 25 years later, she still remembers that poison dart that came out of my mouth. Somebody needed to talk to me in a sermon about how Christians talk to each other over the breakfast table because they are baptized in Jesus Christ, because we belong to Jesus Christ. It shows in how we talk. And I think people today don't know what the shape of Christian living is. And to wrestle with the concrete realities of life through the lens of the epistles is a way to help form them in a life that manifests the gospels in everyday living. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's asking a different set of questions as you come to the epistles than we've asked before. How about, is there anything else you can say to us about technique in terms of, is this preaching through an epistle? What does this look like?
And what it means is, I like your image there, preaching through the epistles, of looking at the world through the epistle rather than preaching the exact text of the epistles. Because some of these ways that Christianity got formed in the early church no longer work for us. They're not our culture, not our society. But if you look through the text, you then see maybe some implications for our culture. Let me give you an example of that. In 1 Timothy 5, the writer says, "Let a widow be put on the widow's list only if she is not less than 60 years old." Now, what in the world would you preach out of that? We don't have widows lists. And if you look through that, what was going on there was, the early church was a community that lived together and supported each other. And what do you do with single women who have no income? Well, you created a widow's list, but a widow was supposed to reciprocate by kind of living out what might be called the office of widow, in which you were a teacher of the Christian faith, especially to younger women. You were, by example and knowledge and experience, a communicator of the Christian faith. You didn't want to put a young woman on there because, practically speaking, as a young woman, she probably is going to fall in love with somebody or get interested in getting married and having children, and there she is on the widow's list. And in the early church, there was a teaching, the single life is better, sex is bad, babies are bad, marriage is bad. And so smuggled into this, let a widow be put on the list if she's only over 60, is not only an affirmation of the wisdom of women in the church, but also an affirmation of the goodness of sexuality, marriage, children, and the life of the flesh, as it were, as a holy life when understood in the Christian faith. So those are powerful kinds of words to our congregations about young women and sexuality, about older women and the role of mentoring in the church. Those are fabulous themes to hit. Here's what your Christian life can look like, smuggled into this seemingly antiquated word from 1 Timothy.
One of the things I hear you doing here, it seems like, is being able to pick up what might seem to be small or almost an afterthought for those of us reading today, but then with a little bit of imagination working out of that seemingly small thing to connect it back to the core of what it means to be Christian. Am I following you there?
You are, in the sense that what is a seemingly irrelevant aside in an epistle, when we pull back and look at it in context, suddenly becomes a countercultural word that has value for our time. That notion of again in 1 Timothy, he's saying, I want to tell you a little bit about worship. I want you to teach your congregation for men to pray with their hands lifted up. Mm-hmm. And then I want you to stop wearing your hair braided. And I want you to stop wearing jewelry. I'm not going to preach that straight. My congregation doesn't pray with hands up necessarily. But if you get into the cultural context, suddenly two countercultural words here are spoken, one to men, one to women. The one to men is pray with your hands open, not with your fist clenched. Mm-hmm. If you think of Christianity as a battle over something, whether it's doctrine or homosexuality or whatever it is, unclench your fist. That's not the way we worship. Right. In the practice is a hospitality to others. And as some third world commentators have pointed out on the women thing, it's not about patriarchal prejudice against women's sexuality. Those women are not trying to look sexy. They're trying to look rich. Hmm. And if you are practicing anything in your worship life that separates you from your sisters and brothers around you, you are not manifesting the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's going to be different things for different congregations in terms of breaking down those social barriers that manifest our hospitality toward others and our equality with others in worship. Right. So yeah, throwaway lines become powerful indicators of cross-cultural truths.
Right. Huh? Right. They could be actually places of jumping off into something really significant. So as a preacher, but I'm trying to play this out a little bit and
what are some techniques?
I was just thinking, so I want to do something with the Corinthian material, right? So you choose, Tom, but I'm just wondering, how do I enter into the work, some of this kind of work as a minister, as a preacher? How would I begin to imagine some sermons out of an epistle? Yeah. And what are the foundation work that I might do?
Fair question. I think there's several sort of practical steps that a preacher can take to let this come alive. And the first one is just the basic know our way around the architecture of a first century Greco-Roman letter. And I won't take time to go over that, but I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. The typical Greco-Roman letter began with a signature. They signed their letters at the beginning. We sign ours at the end. They signed them at the beginning. And so if you are looking at the opening verses of an epistle, know that you're in the signature part, and know that the way a person signs a letter is a huge clue to what's going on in the rest of the letter. For example, I signed some of my letters, Love Tom. If a former student asks me to recommend them for a PhD program, I usually don't sign my letter of recommendation, "Love, Tom." I signed it to Bandy, Emeritus Professor of Preaching at Emory University. I pull out all the stops. Well, look at the way the letters are signed. Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ. Wow, you already know what you're into there. Or in Romans, the signature goes on for about 5 verses. He tells the entire story of the faith. That's on his business card as his personal identifier. And at that point, you know that this letter is going to be a comprehensive depiction of how we fit into the story of God. So first of all, know your way around. Another part of a letter is called a philophronesis. That's I call it fluff, and we have it in our letters today. It's where you, before you get down to the meat of things, you say how wonderful it was that we spent the summer together last summer at Myrtle Beach, our children frolicking in the waves. It was a delightful time. That's philophronesis, establishing a friendly relation. And then you get down to business, but you never paid your part of the rent, and we need to talk about it. And what Paul does in his letters is to change the philophronesis into a prayer list. So if you look at in Corinthians, you were asking about Corinthians, if you look at it, I give thanks to God always for you. And then what follows is a list of every problem he is about to address in the letter. And it's interesting that he gives thanks for the problems, because what we're going to find here is the practical formational truth that God's grace shines through the broken places in our Christian life. And that's built right into that section of the letter. So first of all, let's find our way around the architecture of the letter. Then look at what is being said, but ask about the cultural historical stuff. So that's going to take some exegetical thinking and a little bit of research, is to find out what is actually happening on the ground, such that this word being spoken practically to that on the ground is now seen as a cross-cultural trajectory. It's aimed across that cultural moment in such a way that the gospel opens up and disrupts and creates new possibilities. So we ask ourselves that, what is being disrupted here? What's being created in this trajectory? And then the next step is, this is, some creative thinking and requires some artistic ability, poetic ability, is to say, if that's the way the gospel cut across first century Thessalonica, how does it cut across 21st century America? What's the analog situation that's being opened up here, so that we don't just repeat the ethical advice of the epistle, we let it reverberate in our culture. And that's going to mean not being afraid to talk about concrete realities in the pulpit. And I'm speaking critically of my own preaching here. I have often landed the plane 10,000 feet above the runway, and I have not brought it down to, this is what it looks like. When we moved to this little town in Maryland, my wife and I are both Presbyterian ministers. There's not a Presbyterian church in our county. And so there's a Methodist church every 50 feet, because the Methodist evangelized this 150 years ago. And most of these Methodist churches are little family chapels now. And so there are several of us in town, a lot of us really, who have not been able to find a church. So a few of us formed a house church. And we wanted to be a church of openness and inclusivity, and whoever would like to come can join. And we were, but we were all like-minded people, but the Holy Spirit was not satisfied with that, and has added to our number people who are not like us, who are much more traditional in their theology, even really evangelical or fundamental in their theology. And that's not what we thought we were doing, but that's what God has given us. And what we found out is that everything the New Testament says about the church is true. And that if we're going to be followers of Jesus Christ, we've got to work it out in this little assembly of people. And so when we now read those texts in the epistles about being in harmony with your brothers and sisters, that's not hypothetical for us. We can't go on if we are at enmity with each other. And we don't have ready-made harmony, so we have to work at it. And we need guidance from our preacher to help us think through how to do that. And so that's what I would do practically with these letters, I think.
Yeah. Randy?
Yeah, Tom, I'm sort of following the Q&A, and one of the questions is sort of directly towards this. So I'm just going to read the question, see if you want to say anything more than you just did. I like the impulse towards preaching through the epistles. Could you say a word about how to establish accountability so that we're still preaching the text and not just our own or others' historical reconstructions, imaginings?
Yeah, that's an absolutely wonderful question. And I don't think that question is restricted to preaching on the epistles. I mean, I think any biblical text you go to, you've got to pray to God for insight and forgiveness as you launch from the text into the contemporary situation, because biblical texts, just by their very nature, most of the time do not speak without interpretation into our context, and that's why there is preaching. That's why there's a preacher that puts one foot in the biblical text and one foot in the contemporary situation, and then prays to God that speak to me that I may speak. But I do think honest preachers with integrity have some self-discernment about when you are mangling a text on behalf of your own insights and attitudes, and when you are trying to be faithful to a text. Here's maybe an example of that. 1 Corinthians 6, basically directly to the Corinthians says, don't sue each other in the law courts. Christians don't sue Christians. One way to preach that, of course, is just direct. I want you to cut out any lawsuit against another Christian. I don't want to see you go into court against each other. But actually, the world of courts and the world of society have changed that word doesn't really speak directly as much anymore. What it's really about is you are to be the kind of community that when the world looks at you, they recognize that you are weird. They recognize that you're held together by love and not by self-interest. And that's the word I hear out of that, very practical word I hear out of that. And then I have to figure out, how can our little church look to the world like a community of people who are held together by something other than self-interest, but are held together by the love of Jesus Christ, which creates a fellowship out of them. And that could take 1,000 different forms that don't have anything to do with lawsuits. It could have to do with, wow, see how they love each other. They serve in the cold weather shelter when nobody else will. You know, it can take 1,000 different forms, but I think I'm being faithful to the text, even though I'm not imitating the text.
Right. You know, this starts to raise questions about preaching that speaks to ethics, right? We've gone from preaching to meddling, is the old.
It's a meddling.
It's the old
invitation to meddle.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that. Is that a place where we go as preachers? I mean,
yes, I think it is a place where we go.
If we're going to form a Christian community, right?
Yeah, I think it becomes, just as preaching on the prophetic text, preaching on these texts, it becomes very important not to do what Walter Brueggemann calls triangulating the congregation, in which you stand in the pulpit with your arm around the biblical text and say, the text and I have something against you. But when preachers get up from the pews to preach, part of them stays behind in the pews. And so if I am up there preaching, but knowing that I am under the word as well as preaching the word, it shows in the kind of language that I use. I do not become the authoritarian preacher who wags a finger at people. I become the preacher who is also one of the assembly, one of the congregation, and I'm wrestling with this myself. I may even in the sermon confess how this calls me to a new, like my daughter, speaking with Christian love to my daughter. That's a problem for me as well as for everybody else. And it's a word for me as well as for others. And I think that shows in our preaching, so that we don't come across as a little school marmy meddler, but as somebody wrestling with how does the gospel take shape in our lives.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Hey, we're going to begin to turn toward questions. We've got some that have come in. And I wanted just to say to all of you that are participating today that if you've got a question for Tom, go to the Q&A and drop it in there, and we'll do our best to get to those as we keep rocking along. I want to go back to one thing, Tom, that you were talking about earlier about finding, as we're working with, like we're working out a series of sermons, or we're wrestling with working with out of a particular text or set of texts for a series of sermons. And we're looking for those moments where we might see, trying to remember the language you were using there, but where is that cultural touch point that is being attended to in the letter, and how does that resonate or maybe speak to our cultural touch points? Can you enter back into that space a little and talk about kind of these are where I think homiletical clues begin to emerge. It seems to me.
Right. Well, I talked earlier about a little particular text looking at a piece of ethical advice, and why is that ethical advice the gospel cutting across a cultural issue? You mentioned a series of sermons. Let's say we wanted to preach on Romans, and we would back up and we would ask ourselves, as a good exegete, what is Romans basically about as a whole letter? What are the governing themes here? And we would find there, for example, that one of the things that Romans wrestles with all the way through is the place of different kinds of people in the gospel framework. Begins with righteous and unrighteous, and then there's that agonizing center section where it's Jew and Gentile, as Paul tries to figure out what do the promises of God to Israel mean now if Jesus Christ is Messiah and Lord, and works through that. And then Peter Lampe, the New Testament scholar, has a really interesting take on Romans 16. And I can almost guarantee that no preacher I know has ever preached on Romans 16, because it's simply a collection of names. Greet so-and-so, greet so-and-so, and so on, this list of name after name after name. And Lampe has looked at that chapter not as simply a random set of names, but he's looked at it as a kindergarten teacher would look at the roll of her class before the class shows up in the fall, trying to figure out by the names, who are these people? Mm-hmm. And well, that's an African-American name. That's a Hispanic name. So Lampe looks at this, and what he finds is some of the names are Jewish, some of the names are Gentiles. Some of the names Paul says, you have worked with me in the gospel. Those are almost always women's names. He finds there names of people that we know from other records were Gentiles who were entitled, but who sold themselves into slavery in order to contribute money to the church for the widows and the orphans. And suddenly, there at the end is, in the naming of the names, is Paul's vision of everybody at the welcome table. Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, poor and rich, There they all are. And that's my vision of the church too, when I'm under the mind of Jesus Christ and not under my own mind of trying to get the church to look like me.
Yes, that's good. Randy?
Yeah, there's a couple of other questions here that are really interesting. One of them is sort of preaching technique. Can you give suggestions towards merging narrative style with epistles preaching? Because stories still have power, right?
Yeah, in fact, that's actually what I'm working on now in my own preaching. I'm not going to abandon narrative preaching. I'm a narrative preacher. The gospel is a story, and so we shouldn't abandon narrative preaching. But the shift I'm making in my own technique is not to depend upon the power of story entirely as the muscle in the sermon. That I am increasingly aware that the powerful narratives that I have been telling in my preaching are not landing home with congregations like I think they used to. I think they are simply interesting stories, but people don't know what to do with them. And so I have not taken the extra step of saying, if that story's true, then how shall we live? And getting explicit about that. Or to do the reverse, getting explicit about how then does the gospel call us to live? What shape of living does it call us to do? And then telling stories that exemplify that so that people can see it embodied in actual people's lives. So there's a blending of teaching, ethics, and narration that works toward the ultimate unified goal of people leaving church not simply having been titillated or entertained or inspired, but people leaving church ready to live a different kind of way, or at least to think about what it might mean to live a different way. The people in our congregations who have jobs, I don't care if they work for the Red Cross, they make tough moral decisions every day. And almost every one of them is aware of moral compromises. If you work at the hardware store or the insurance agency, whatever you do, there are 1,000 moral compromises you make every day in order to be employed in America. And I've not been helping them. And so I want to help them see what it might look like, wrestle with. I don't know the answers to all of it, but to wrestle with what it might look like to live as a Christian at State Farm. And so sometimes I'll tell stories about that, and sometimes I'll be explicit about the shape of life, and sometimes I will teach the doctrine that gets lived out in that way.
Yeah, that's good.
So I'm curious. I'm going to kind of work around another question here. Maybe this isn't true, but it seems to me that more people come to church with their guard up than used to. That there are those folks out there who are confused. I don't know what the shape of the Christian life is. And then there's a bunch of folks out there who think they know exactly what it is. Right. And they're pretty guarded about anything that's going to kind of bump into that. It's not quite hostility, but it's close. How do you think that's wrong? How do you think about that?
Yes, I've been thinking a lot about that. I think that's a terrifically vexing question. The toxicity of discourse in our culture has become toxic in our sanctuaries as well. I think it was Russell Moore on NPR. Russell was the former editor of the Southern Baptist Journal, and he was being interviewed on NPR, and he says so many preachers now have the experience of, in their sermons, saying things like "turn the other cheek" or "love your enemies" or "bless those who persecute you," and at the door get attacked. Where'd you get that junk? Well, I'm quoting Jesus. Oh yeah, well that's weak. And it's a an adversarial relationship, not only built out of an understanding of their understanding of the Christian faith, but a kind of a rejection of the Christian faith is there. If that's the Christian faith, I reject it in favor of something stronger, sterner. I don't want to make it too easy on myself to think that there's some magic formula for me to cut through that toxicity. I don't think Jesus cut through it. I think they killed him because of that toxicity. But I do think I am most able to bridge that divide when it's coming across that I am speaking out of humility, that I am not simply peddling my own political biases in the name of the gospel, the question you raised earlier, that in my preaching, before I am speaking what I think the gospel is, I'm showing that I understand the resistance to the gospel. I'm able to articulate why people would find this noxious. And I think that's why and here we're moving out of epistles, but not necessarily, the gospels too, spend so much time on resistance, so much time talking about how Jesus and in Acts, the preaching of the gospel stirs up every resistance that the world has. And so I don't guarantee that we're not going to get crucified with Jesus. I think we probably are, but in all kinds of ways. But I do think when we speak a word of love with humility, it has a better chance of being heard even in a toxic environment.
Some of this conversation, Tom, prompts as we move to think beyond narrative kinds of preaching to this more to looking at text that are more epistemal, that come out of the epistles. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of a conversation you had here at ACU. You were on our campus a number of years ago and talked about some of the ways preaching was changing. And you talked about, maybe we need to take a little longer time, and our sermons may need to be a little longer these days. We've got a little more formative or constructive work for people to hear a word today. In some ways, some of the things you're describing here would continue to lend to that kind of space, I think. I'd just be curious, in terms of being able to draw people in to look at our behavior, the way we live together, our habits, our ethics. Is there still some work we've got to do to actually set the table for that? I guess I'm thinking a little bit about Randy's prior question as well.
Yeah. I'm continue to be puzzled a little bit by the example of Tim Keller, who preached 45-minute sermons to a room packed with the generations most of us are missing in our churches, who sat there and listened to highly doctrinal, highly ethical sermons. And so the first point I think I'd like to make is I'm not sure that I want to preach exactly like Tim Keller preached, but I am instructed by that if we are honestly addressing real issues in people's lives and how they live in practical ways, that there is a patience for preaching that lasts more than 12 minutes or 17 minutes. The second thing I want to say is that we don't know a whole lot about this, but I think it's important to kind of think it through, the generic rituals of preaching. I preach myself, I've timed myself, and I'm 17 or 18 minutes usually. If I go to All Saints Episcopal Church in Atlanta, where they're used to 7-minute sermons, and I preach my 17-minute sermon, the last 10 minutes of it are going to be toil for that congregation. I don't care what I'm saying, because they are ritually, generically trained that this is what you get for a sermon. It's the length of 7 minutes. If I go to Union Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey, a large African-American congregation, and preach 17 minutes, it'll seem like an appetizer. The Holy Spirit doesn't get there till 1:30. They expect wrestling with the word over a long and participatory call and response kind of style. So let me get practical about this. If I'm preaching at my church where I regularly preach, and I've been preaching 17 or 18 minutes, and I want to spend 20 or 25 minutes this morning wrestling with something, I'm going to break their generic expectation. So I think it's helpful communicationally to get permission. And I don't mean written permission. What I mean is you start the sermon off by saying, we got an important issue to talk about this morning, and I want you to put your thinking caps on and wrestle with me. That alerts them that I'm breaking the bounds of what they generically expect. And I think that helps. And if I do that enough times with their permission, tacit permission, then they'll get used to experiencing meatier sermons. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to break the rhythm here and there. When the issue is tough, you wrestle with it as long as it takes. When you're really wanting to assure them about something and it can be done briefly, do it briefly.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah, I do wonder that the issue is partly their expectations, but part of the deal on length is the sermon efficient or not? If it's a 45-minute sermon and 20 minutes aren't really doing much of anything.
Of course, of course, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
if we take 5 minutes or take 50 minutes, it's important to use those minutes well, however long it's there. Don't waste their time. They know about time wasting, and in our culture, it's both a blessing and a curse that our culture gets to the point in terms of communication. There's been a lot of studies of emails. You don't get a lot of these niceties in emails like philophronesis. It just bang gets to the point. Don't bother me with what I don't need. That's a blessing and it's a curse, because in human communication, we need more than just boom. We need some courtship. We need some affection. We need some building of relationship. We need some affirmation of the other, and wrestling with what really matters and what really counts. Preaching's tough, but it's what makes it exciting.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, we're beginning to move toward the top of the hour. It's been such a delight to have this conversation today. I want to ask both you and Randy, as you reflect about this past hour, what would be the one thing that really stands out to you, or the one thing you'd want to leave our participants with as we close today? Tom, could I start with you as you think about what we've talked about today, and you think about the work of preaching? What would be the one thing you'd want to leave our participants with today?
I think I would want to say that generosity requires us to look out on Sunday morning and see people who want to live as disciples of Jesus Christ, but who are pulled by our culture in 1,000 different directions, and who have what might be called a near Christianity in most cases that needs to be deepened and given roots, and to speak to them not as children, but to speak to them as children in the faith who are eager to be formed. Mm-hmm. And that's what I would want to take away.
That's good. That's good work that you're describing when you say that. It seems to me, Randy, what would you, as you reflect about what we've talked about today? You're on mute.
There are a number of things, but I think to learn not to be a slavish imitator of the epistles, but to try to preach sermons that say the word to our culture that they were saying to their culture, and kind of doing the hard work of thinking, okay, if they were saying it today, what would they be saying? How would it sound? And to being both faithful to the text and faithful to the moment is just such hard work. But it's kind of what we signed up for, right?
All right.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And again, that's hard. It's hard work, but it is good work. It is good work. Maybe it's because I see a lot of preachers on this panel, or our attendees today. My heart really goes out to the hard and good work that preachers every Sunday get up to do. And it's a delight, Tom, to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. And this dialogue is so rich. For those of you participating, thank you for joining us today. Our last intersection for the year, in December, is coming up on December the 5th. December 5, it's Tuesday. It'll be at 10 a.m. as well, 10 a.m. Central Time. We'll have Dr. Chelsie Sargent with us. We're going to talk about self-care and the church leader. I think Chelsea's probably been one of our most frequent participants with Intersection. We always get such great response when she's with us. That'll be a great conversation as we think about as we move into the holiday season with people in congregational leadership. So thanks to Renee, to Shelby for their work today. And again, thank you, Tom, for you joining us from Maryland to be a part of this conversation. Randy, would you please offer a good word, a benediction for us today?
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.